October 1941. Snow creeps across the Russian plains as Germany's best generals beg their Führer to stop. Supply lines are breaking. The army is freezing. Moscow is slipping away. But Hitler answers them with a conviction so absolute, it will push the Eastern Front toward catastrophe. The road to Moscow was supposed to be the final march. The last decisive thrust that would break the Soviet Union before winter set its grip on the land. But by late autumn 1941, the vision that had propelled Operation Barbarossa forward with stunning speed had begun to fade beneath a sky the color of steel. The German advance, once a torrent sweeping across the vast plains of the USSR, now staggered forward like a giant whose strength was running out. For 5 relentless months, Hitler's armies had driven deeper and deeper into Soviet territory, more than 1,600 kilometers from the Reich's eastern borders. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, had smashed through frontier defenses, encircled entire Soviet armies at Bialystok, Smolensk, and Vyazma, and opened the road to the Soviet capital. By early November, some spearheads were within 20 to 30 kilometers of Moscow. Through binoculars, officers reported seeing the faint glow of the city's lights on the horizon on clear nights. But the great advance had come at a price that was becoming impossible to ignore. Behind the leading panzers, the logistical arteries of the Wehrmacht were collapsing. Supply columns struggled across roads turned to mud, then frozen ruts. Horses, still the backbone of German logistics, collapsed and died by the thousands along the roadside. Trucks seized up in the cold. Ammunition arrived days late. Fuel arrived in half loads, then quarter loads, then not at all. Army Group Center had already suffered 30–40% losses in equipment, and replacements were scarce. The infantry marching behind the armor suffered worst of all. Exhausted, underdressed, and battered from continuous fighting since June, many men wrapped themselves in Soviet scarves, blankets, even curtains stripped from abandoned villages. Their standard-issue boots, designed for European autumns, not Russian winters, froze solid overnight. Fingers blackened from frostbite. Officers reported that rifles jammed, machine guns cracked, and oil-soaked cloths stiffened in the cold. This wasn't yet winter, not officially, but temperatures had already begun falling well below freezing, sometimes to 10 degrees C, then 20 degrees C in exposed positions. The Wehrmacht had not been equipped for a long campaign. The planners in Berlin had expected victory before the cold arrived. Now the cold was here. Inside command dugouts, the warnings grew louder. Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff, noted in his diary that units were nearing the end of their strength. Heinz Guderian, leading the 2nd Panzer Army, warned that his tanks were literally freezing to the earth at night, and that fuel shortages prevented even minimal maneuver. He reminded headquarters that his formations had been in continuous combat since the invasion began. Von Bock pressed for rest and reorganization, arguing that the men could not endure much longer. But in Wolfschanz, Hitler bristled at each complaint. He dismissed reports of exhaustion as defeatism, insisting that one final push would break Soviet resistance entirely. The Führer believed Moscow was on the edge of collapse, and that the Soviets were bluffing, masking their last reserves behind propaganda. On the front, generals now faced a brutal equation. Men who could barely march, tanks that barely moved, and fuel that barely arrived, yet orders demanding constant advance. Then in the final days of November, the skies darkened. A massive Arctic storm rolled south, weeks earlier than German meteorologists had predicted. Snow fell in choking sheets. Winds howled across the open plains. Temperatures plunged further, freezing fuel lines and the last hopes of a quick victory. The gates of Moscow lay ahead, close enough to imagine, too far to reach. And now the winter had arrived, determined to decide the fate of the campaign. The closer the German armies pushed toward Moscow, the deeper a different kind of battle unfolded behind the lines. One fought not with tanks or rifles, but with reports, warnings, and the clash of two worldviews. It was a struggle inside the German High Command itself, where the cold realities of the Eastern Front collided with Adolf Hitler's ideological certainty. After the massive encirclements at Kiev in September 1941, the largest in military history, with more than 600,000 Soviet soldiers captured, Hitler's confidence had soared. He proclaimed the Red Army finished and insisted that the Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay. In his mind, the entire system would collapse under the weight of a single decisive blow. But to the professional officer corps, the battlefield told a different story. General Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff, recorded the growing contradiction in his diary. Even in October, as German columns raced toward Moscow, Halder noted the dangerous overextension of their supply lines and the astonishing resilience of Soviet reserves. Reports from the front described divisions reduced to half strength, tank units running on fumes, and troops suffering from frostbite before winter had even begun. Halder understood that the Wehrmacht's initial victories had been achieved at immense cost, and that the enemy was adapting. General Heinz Guderian, commanding the 2nd Panzer Army, offered similar warnings. His field diaries reveal a growing frustration: engines failing in the cold, tanks immobilized for lack of fuel, infantry unable to keep pace after months of forced marches. Guderian argued repeatedly that without operational pauses, resupply, and rest, the drive on Moscow was becoming unreasonable. Yet each time he raised these concerns, he encountered the same response from Berlin: push forward. At the center of the divide was Hitler's shifting emotional state. The triumph at Kiev had reinforced his belief that ideological willpower, not logistics or strategy, determined victory. He increasingly distrusted the professional military leadership, accusing them of lacking faith and resolve. In his headquarters at Rastenburg, Hitler began to micromanage the campaign, issuing direct orders to corps and division commanders, bypassing the operational expertise of the Army High Command, OKH. Meanwhile, Halder's memos warned that Soviet manpower was far from exhausted. Intelligence reports indicated that the USSR was mobilizing over 1 million new troops, forming fresh armies behind the capital. But Hitler dismissed the figures as exaggerations or fabrications. He insisted that the Soviets were scraping the bottom of the barrel, and that one final blow would bring the campaign to an end. Inside command tents on the Eastern Front, generals exchanged private predictions of disaster. They studied the plunging temperatures, the growing Soviet resistance, and the dwindling supplies, and saw the outline of a catastrophe forming. But none dared openly confront Hitler. The Führer's word had become absolute, his intolerance for dissent unmistakable. By late November, as the snow deepened and the front lines bled dry, the tension reached its breaking point. Berlin demanded explanations for the slowing advance. The generals demanded the resources and time they no longer had. And in the Wolfschanz, Hitler summoned his senior commanders. He wanted their final assessment, one last chance for them to justify their caution, or for him to impose his will completely. In the first days of November 1941, as snow swallowed the forests of the Eastern Front, a different kind of chill settled over the Wolfschanz, Hitler's heavily fortified headquarters in East Prussia. Here, far from the frontline trenches and frozen tank fields, the fate of the Moscow offensive would be decided. The atmosphere inside the conference room was tense, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the frost carried in on the uniforms of officers who had just traveled from the front. One by one, the senior commanders of Army Group Center stepped forward to present the realities they had witnessed. These were not theoretical assessments or cautious projections. They were hard facts. First came the reports from the panzer armies. The cold was turning steel into prison bars, tracks frozen in place, engines cracking open. Panzer regiments that had once spearheaded the invasion now counted dozens of immobile vehicles, locked to the earth each morning. Mechanics worked through the night with blowtorches just to thaw fuel lines long enough for a few hours of movement. Infantry officers followed with their own grim data. Tens of thousands of soldiers lacked proper winter clothing. The Wehrmacht's supply system had never prepared for sub-zero operations. Men wrapped themselves in whatever cloth they could find: Soviet blankets, carpets, even wallpaper ripped from abandoned villages. But frostbite cases were already rising sharply. Field hospitals reported amputations every day. Then came the horse-mounted logistics commanders. More than 120,000 horses had supported the push across the Soviet Union. Now they were collapsing by the hundreds, their flanks trembling in the cold, their bodies left stiff along the roads that fed the German advance. Without them, artillery pieces, supply wagons, and fuel carts remained stuck miles behind the front. Fuel officers presented maps showing entire divisions immobilized. Columns that needed 20,000 liters a day received barely a tenth of that. Some panzer units had enough fuel for a single attack, nothing more. And finally, the intelligence brief. The Soviets were not breaking. They were rebuilding. Behind Moscow, new defensive belts were forming. Reservists, cadets, Siberian divisions, and newly mobilized conscripts, more than 1 million fresh troops, were being moved into position. A massive counteroffensive was clearly in preparation. One general after another repeated the conclusion: Moscow could not be taken before winter. To continue pushing was to risk total collapse of the front. Hitler listened in silence at first, his expression hardening with every report. Then, in a sudden eruption of anger documented by multiple witnesses, he dismissed every warning as exaggeration and defeatist talk. He insisted that the Red Army was on the brink of disintegration, that the Soviet system was collapsing from within, and that Germany stood at the threshold of final victory. "The Russian Colossus is a house of cards," he declared, a phrase Halder later recorded. "One hard blow and it will fall." When generals mentioned the worsening blizzards, Hitler waved the concern aside. When they described exhausted troops, he accused them of lacking faith. He rejected any talk of retreat, pause, or logistical regrouping. Strategy, he claimed, belonged to him alone. The room fell into a heavy silence, not from the winter outside, but from the weight of the decision he was about to impose. And then he delivered it, without hesitation. Hitler ordered the attack to continue. The moment Hitler ordered the advance to continue, the frontline troops understood a truth their leaders in Berlin refused to see. The campaign for Moscow was no longer a military operation. It was becoming a test of human endurance against an enemy far more relentless than the Red Army, the Russian winter. By mid-November 1941, the temperatures plunged past 20 degrees C. Soldiers began calling it the Iron Winter, a cold so sharp it felt like metal on skin. Breath froze into crystals. Water bottles turned solid. Within days, the mercury fell to 30 degrees C, then 40 degrees C. The Wehrmacht had no clothing built for such extremes. Uniforms stiffened. Greatcoats cracked when bent. Leather boots froze solid overnight. Weapons refused to function. Rifle bolts jammed with ice even after being scraped clean. The MG-34, the backbone of German infantry firepower, seized up after a few bursts. Machine gun crews resorted to lighting fires beneath their weapons, a dangerous and often futile attempt to keep them warm enough to operate. Ammunition belts snapped like twigs. The panzers suffered even worse. Engines cracked open from thermal shock. Gearboxes froze. Tracks, once the symbol of German mobility, fused to the ground each morning. Mechanics used blowtorches for hours just to coax a single tank to life, only for it to freeze solid again by nightfall. Entire armored battalions became immobile hulks in the snow. For the infantry, the winter became a torment that defied imagination. Frostbite struck within minutes on exposed skin. Fingers blackened. Toes died before men even realized they were numb. Medics, already overwhelmed by months of combat, were suddenly treating thousands of cases of cold injuries, amputations performed without anesthetic, simply because none was available. The suffering extended beyond the soldiers. The horses, indispensable to German logistics, collapsed by the thousands. Their bodies lay frozen along the supply routes, grim markers of a plan that had failed to account for the fury of the Russian climate. Without them, artillery remained stuck, wagons sat unmoving, and frontline units starved for fuel, ammunition, and food. On the front line, German soldiers recorded their despair in diaries that survived the war. One wrote, "We no longer fear the enemy, we fear the cold. It kills faster than bullets." Another confessed, "Victory is no longer our goal, survival is our only thought." What had begun as the most ambitious offensive in European military history had devolved into a brutal struggle simply to stay alive. Yet orders from the Wolfschans remained unchanged. Attack, hold, stand fast. No retreat, no pause, no winter clothing until spring. Generals, once confident in the momentum of Barbarossa, now exchanged encrypted messages filled with dread. Among them circulated a stark assessment. This war cannot be won in 1941. Some added a more desperate line in private notes. Perhaps not at all. As November turned into December, the Red Army sensed its moment. Reinforced by Siberian divisions fresh from the Far East, men trained and equipped for exactly this kind of winter, Soviet commanders prepared a massive counteroffensive. Artillery batteries, once silent, began to thunder along the front. New armies assembled behind the lines. And then, without warning, the horizon erupted in fire. Soviet counterattacks slammed into the frozen German front from Kalinin to Tula. The opening blows of a storm far deadlier than anything the Wehrmacht had yet faced. The final drive on Moscow began not with a roar of engines, but with the slow, grinding movement of exhausted divisions forcing themselves through a landscape turning to white stone. By late November 1941, the Wehrmacht's advance had become a crawl, a desperate attempt to reach the Soviet capital before the last breath of mobility vanished into the winter air. At the center of this push were two formations carrying the burden of Hitler's orders: General Erich Hopner's 4th Panzer Group in the north, and General Georg Hans Reinhardt's 3rd Panzer Army in the center. These units had once been the spearheads of Blitzkrieg, sweeping across Western Europe with breathtaking speed. Now their panzers moved at walking pace, engines coughing in the cold, tracks slipping on polished ice. Infantrymen marched beside them, wrapped in rags and blankets scavenged from burnt-out villages. Many had long since lost their gloves, others kept their fingers tucked beneath their armpits as they walked. Frost-bitten faces stared forward toward a horizon that promised victory and delivered only more snow. The final approach to Moscow revealed a battlefield shaped deliberately and brutally by the Red Army. Soviet commanders ordered villages along the axis of advance to be burned to the ground, denying the Germans shelter from the cold and eliminating any cover for staging positions. Entire hamlets vanished in orange flame, leaving only skeletons of chimneys rising from the snow. More devastating still were the fields flooded by retreating Soviet engineers. Water released from streams and reservoirs spread across low ground, turning farmland into mirrors of black ice. German panzers that attempted to cross became trapped, sometimes frozen in place overnight, sometimes sliding helplessly into ditches dug beneath the snow. These were not accidents. They were deliberate Soviet ice traps designed to slow and bleed the advance. As the Wehrmacht closed within 30 kilometers of Moscow, they encountered another problem. The Red Army had dug entire trench systems invisible under the snow. German patrols stumbled into them unexpectedly, falling into hidden firing lines, barbed wire entanglements, and machine gun nests that appeared only when they opened fire. Every kilometer became a battle, every village became a fortress. Yet the Germans pushed onward. The 4th Panzer Group fought toward the Moscow-Volga Canal, capturing Klin and pushing toward the industrial outskirts. The 3rd Panzer Army drove through Istra, clawing its way along frozen ridges and forest roads. Some spearheads reached positions where, on clear nights, soldiers could see a faint orange glow on the eastern horizon. It was the reflection of Moscow's lights, the city that had eluded Napoleon, now shimmering before them like a ghost. But the approach was an illusion of distance, not progress. Engines froze, men collapsed, ammunition ran low. The tanks that had broken Europe now stalled in silence. The German advance, after 5 months and 1,600 kilometers, could move no farther. The lights of Moscow were visible, but the Wehrmacht could not take a single step closer. November 1941. The landscape between Smolensk and Moscow had frozen into a vast white desert, and along every sector of the front, the German advance had ground to a shivering halt. Engines refused to start. Horses collapsed in the snow. Men wrapped in inadequate uniforms shivered around dying fires. And as the crisis deepened, the generals who had led the Wehrmacht's spearheads toward Moscow now turned back, toward Führer headquarters, to deliver the truth no one wanted to hear. They arrived one by one, or sent cables so urgent that couriers traveled through blizzards to deliver them. The message was identical across the entire breadth of Army Group Center. There was no fuel. Panzer Group 2 under Heinz Guderian reported that armored divisions were at a standstill, many tanks frozen to the ground each night. Vehicles that did move did so on shared pools of scavenged gasoline, cannibalized from knocked-out machines. Supply columns, already stretched over hundreds of miles of hostile territory, were collapsing under partisan attacks and weather that turned every road into a frozen obstacle course. There was no mobility. The Wehrmacht had lost the speed that had defined blitzkrieg. What had once been a lightning advance was now an army trudging through waist-deep snow. Trucks broke down. Horses died faster than they could be replaced. Artillery pieces were abandoned simply because they could no longer be dragged forward. Non-combat casualties were rising at a rate no staff officer had imagined. Frostbite, typhus, dysentery, trench foot. Illness was claiming thousands every week, hollowing divisions that had once been counted among Germany's finest. And still the Soviet Union was not collapsing. Reinforcements, hundreds of thousands of fresh troops from Siberia and the Far East, were arriving at the front lines with winter clothing, functioning equipment, and a determination forged by the defense of their homeland. The balance of manpower and morale was shifting. When Guderian met with Hitler in late November, his warning was blunt, written in cold military precision. Any further advance means catastrophe. Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff, delivered his own assessment shortly after. The Eastern Front, he declared, had reached its limit. If the army did not pull back to defensible winter positions, disaster was inevitable. For a moment, there was silence inside Führer headquarters. Then Hitler erupted. Retreat was forbidden. No withdrawal, he thundered, not one step back. He accused his own commanders of weakness, of lacking the will to seize victory when it was still within grasp. He dismissed their reports as exaggerations, their fears as cowardice. The generals stood there, men who had survived Poland, France, and the early triumphs of Operation Barbarossa, exchanging despairing glances. They knew the truth. This order, delivered in anger and denial, might not just halt the advance. It could destroy the army. On 5 December 1941, as temperatures plunged below 30 degrees C, the eastern horizon lit with the flashes of thousands of Soviet guns. What followed was the largest counteroffensive Germany had faced since the war began. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, newly appointed to command the defense of Moscow, unleashed more than 1 million fresh troops, many drawn from Siberian divisions equipped for winter warfare. Behind them came tanks that started reliably in the cold, ski battalions that moved with speed across frozen forests, and artillery units supported by newly reorganized supply lines. For the first time since June, the German army was no longer advancing. It was being driven back. Across a 1,000-kilometer front, Soviet shock groups struck with overwhelming force. Near Kalinin, the 30th Army shattered German positions and drove them back nearly 20 kilometers in a matter of days. Around Klin and Tula, newly arrived Soviet rifle divisions forced entire German corps into retreat. Motorized infantry that had once spearheaded Operation Barbarossa now fought desperately just to avoid encirclement. German lines cracked under pressure. What began as localized breaches quickly expanded into a rolling collapse. Supply depots, already threadbare from months of overextension, fell to Soviet assaults, their contents lost or captured. Frontline companies reported that ammunition was running out, fuel stocks had vanished, and rations were reduced to almost nothing. Frozen weapons jammed. Vehicles stalled. Horses died in the snow. Commanders faced an impossible choice: obey Hitler's absolute order for no retreat, or pull their men back to survive. Some obeyed and paid dearly. Units that held their ground were swallowed by Soviet breakthroughs, losing hundreds or even thousands of men in hours. Others defied the order. General Heinz Guderian, recognizing the catastrophe unfolding along his sector, authorized tactical withdrawals to avoid encirclement, actions that directly violated Hitler's commands. He later wrote that refusing to retreat would have meant the annihilation of the army. His decision saved tens of thousands of soldiers, but placed his career, and possibly his life, at risk. Hitler's reaction was volcanic. From the Wolf's Lair, he raged at his generals, accusing them of defeatism, incompetence, and betrayal. He dismissed commanders who failed to hold impossible positions, replacing them with officers he believed would enforce obedience over judgment. The crisis deepened with every change. By late December, the truth could no longer be denied. The German army was retreating along the entire front. The gates of Moscow, once nearly within reach, were now beyond hope. The dream of capturing the Soviet capital in 1941, Hitler's boldest ambition, had collapsed under the weight of winter, Soviet resilience, and strategic delusion. And for the first time, a grim realization settled over the Wehrmacht. Moscow would not fall, perhaps it never would. As the first news of the Soviet counteroffensive reached the Wolfschans, the atmosphere inside Hitler's headquarters became electric with tension. Reports of entire divisions collapsing, supply depots overrun, and front lines pushed back 10 to 20 kilometers arrived with relentless urgency. Commanders pleaded for permission to adjust positions, to regroup, to save their men from the encroaching winter and the Red Army's massed counterattacks. Hitler listened, then he spoke. In documented statements recorded by Halder, Cadel, and other senior officers, he dismissed every warning with contempt. The generals, he claimed, were ignorant of political reality, their concerns irrelevant in the grand scheme of Germany's destiny. Moscow, he insisted, was unimportant, a city, he argued, that could be taken at any time, even after winter. If setbacks occurred, he blamed the weather, equipment, or the supposed failings of subordinates, never the strategic decisions he himself had made. In the Wolfschans, he positioned himself as a man betrayed by fate rather than a commander who had ignored repeated professional advice. He insisted that the army was advancing according to plan, that the campaign was progressing, and that morale must be maintained at all costs. The truth he refused to face was plain to the generals before him. Their armies were exhausted, freezing, and overextended, yet the Führer's directives left no room for withdrawal or adaptation. And then came his final word, chilling in its simplicity and its authority. Stand fast, hold every meter. Victory will come to the steadfast. No concession, no acknowledgement of reality, no recognition that the Soviet storm, the sub-zero temperatures, and the logistical collapse were not abstract inconveniences, but active threats that had already shattered the Wehrmacht's momentum. In Hitler's worldview, steadfastness alone could summon victory from catastrophe. The bitter irony was already being written in the snow-covered forests and fields outside Moscow. The man who refused to give a single step of ground now demanded the ultimate endurance from his commanders and their men, while the army itself was being forced to retreat again and again. Over the next 4 years, the stubborn insistence on standing fast would shape the course of the war, turning tactical defeats into strategic catastrophes, and etching a record of suffering and loss that no rhetoric, no orders, and no ideology could conceal. By the close of 1941, the consequences of Hitler's refusal to heed his generals were painfully clear across the frozen expanse of the Eastern Front. Over 750,000 German casualties, killed, wounded, or incapacitated by frostbite, had been suffered in just 5 months. Entire divisions were reduced to skeletons, their equipment destroyed, their morale shattered. What had begun as a lightning campaign designed to crush the Soviet Union in weeks now stalled permanently at the gates of Moscow. Operation Barbarossa, the boldest military endeavor in European history, had run headlong into limits no strategy or ideology could overcome. The Wehrmacht, once the engine of blitzkrieg, was forced onto the defensive. Hitler's insistence on advancing despite fuel shortages, freezing temperatures, and exhausted troops turned a campaign of conquest into a 2-year struggle for mere survival. German armies dug in to hold what ground they could, while Soviet counterattacks slowly regained territory lost in the summer. The rhythm of the Eastern Front had changed. The attacker had become the defender, and the Soviet Union, long presumed fragile and disorganized, now displayed resilience, coordination, and a renewed morale that would carry it through the worst of the war. The myth of German invincibility, the aura that had conquered Poland, France, and the Low Countries, was shattered. For soldiers on both sides, for citizens across Europe, the story of a Wehrmacht that could sweep all opposition aside was no longer credible. Moscow had survived, and with it, the hope of the Soviet people and the legitimacy of their leadership. Equally profound was the effect on Hitler's relationship with his generals. The trust between the military high command and the Führer, already strained by ideological interference and micromanagement, reached a breaking point. Strategic advice, operational warnings, and professional judgment were increasingly ignored, punished, or dismissed as cowardice. Officers learned that initiative carried risk not just on the battlefield, but at the conference table, where defiance could mean dismissal, arrest, or worse. Historians now view this moment as one of the most disastrous leadership decisions in modern military history. By refusing to recognize the limits imposed by terrain, climate, logistics, and enemy capability, Hitler set in motion a chain of events that would consume millions of lives and weaken Germany's strategic position irreparably. And yet, in the snow-covered forests outside Moscow, the consequences were immediate and undeniable. The Eastern Front, vast and brutal, had begun its long, inexorable grind. A warning had been given, but the leader in charge refused to listen. The turning point was at hand, born not of strategy, but of obstinacy. The Eastern Front would devour millions more lives, but its deadly momentum began with a refusal to confront reality and the human cost that such denial demanded.